Welcome to The Climate Question from the BBC World Service with Kate Lamble
and Neil Rizal. How'd you like to spend your whole year with Russia's president?
Not what I expected as an opener. Are you referring to my fascination with Vladimir Putin calendars?
I certainly am.
OK, favourite photo, what is it?
How do you even choose?
True. Shirtless with a rifle.
Shirtless on a horse.
Throwing a judo opponent to the mat.
Astride a giant motorcycle.
As though running the world's largest country with the largest nuclear arsenal wasn't macho enough.
But let's not pigeonhole him. He does have a softer side.
True, there's the whole animal theme. Tenderly holding a kitten.
Relaxing with a leopard cub.
Clearly, this is a man who can do it all.
Thank goodness, because Russia's got a lot to do. It is the fourth largest emitter of greenhouse gases.
Which means Mr Putin is going to have to rip off his shirt and wrestle Russian emissions to the mat.
To the top! So our climate question is, can he do it?
We are, of course, joking, but this is a serious question.
And we have been speaking to some serious people, most of them in Russia.
But one in the US, Chris Miller, a Russia expert with the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
Is it possible to talk about reducing Russian emissions without talking about President Putin?
It's not possible, in large part because Vladimir Putin has constructed his entire political system on the wealth that producing oil and natural gas have made possible. People are loyal to him not primarily because they think he's an excellent president, not primarily because they like or trust him personally. People are loyal to him because he provides them more benefits than an alternative would.
Hang on. He's saying it's not the calendars.
Niet.
All of Russian politics depends on the money that selling oil and gas provide.
Chris is hardly exaggerating. Up to half of all the money the Kremlin has to spend comes from fossil fuels.
Imagine everything it pays for, from schools to submarines.
Pensions to prisons.
And so when the Kremlin thinks about what would a decarbonized Russia look like, it's thinking about a political revolution. It would have to rewrite the rules of Russian politics, restructure the networks that have kept Putin in power. And that's why, for many people in the Kremlin, decarbonization isn't simply an economic challenge. It's a political risk, and it's even a personal risk.
Sounds like Mr. Putin's battle to bring down emissions will be tougher than we thought.
The way Chris Miller puts it, he's fighting himself.
The inner opponent, they say, is always the toughest. For clues as to what he's up against, we need to turn back the clock.
Within the last hour, President Gorbachev has resigned. Boris Yeltsin is now in full control. The last president of the Soviet Union went on television to tell his...
In December 1991, the red and yellow flag of the Soviet Union was lowered over the Kremlin and replaced with the white, blue and red of the Russian Federation.
Across the nation, change was coming to nearly every aspect of life.
The Iron Curtain was dissolving. Russia was opening up.
Angelina Davidova was a teenager heading off to university.
My grandfather and I used to go to the nearest metro station to participate in a political demonstration dedicated to some national and local issues. Press finally started writing what was truly happening in the country. So it was a very exciting time on one hand. On the other hand, many people lost their jobs. My father was among them. And suddenly most families didn't have enough money to live on. A number of cities and regions in Russia introduced food rationing. So overall, the situation became somewhat very difficult to survive and to live.
In 1999, Angelina started her career as an environmental journalist. The same year, a former KGB officer and would-be calendar star, Vladimir Putin, became acting president of Russia.
More than 20 years later, he's still president.
Much of his focus, particularly in the early days, was rebuilding the economy after the chaos of the 90s.
Putin, when he took power at the turn of the millennium, very aggressively tried to centralize this process in his own hands. He put his friends in top positions. He made sure that anyone he distrusted was purged from a position of authority. And so the Russian state was reconstructed, but it was reconstructed in a way that was almost inseparable from Putin personally, because he had personally selected all of the top officials.
Take the all-important oil and gas sector.
There's a lot of interconnections between the government and the large oil and gas companies. What I mean with that is sometimes it might not be very clear who defines politics, whether it's the companies who define the politics or whether it's the politicians ruling the companies. Sometimes it's so complicated, you cannot really say who's in charge.
We're going to come back to that theme of who's really in charge later.
But naturally, this network of power had a keen interest in pumping more oil and gas. And they did. Production increased after Putin came to office.
And in wider society, as you can imagine, with food rationing, with families struggling to survive, talk of limiting fossil fuel use to prevent climate change would have felt out of touch.
There was this general understanding in Russia that environmental topics is maybe something more for European countries who already have very high quality of life and can care about the environment, can care about organic products or something similar.
This thinking has roots that run even deeper than the 1990s. Russia has been through many devastating events, from the tyranny of Stalinism to World War II, where Russia's losses dwarfed those of most other countries.
Many people became used to focusing on short-term survival rather than what the world might look like for their great-great-grandchildren.
So the idea of tackling a long-term problem like climate change is not just a hard sell. To some Russian ears, it's absurd.
Which might explain why Mr. Putin himself has spoken publicly about the benefits a temperature rise might bring.
Vladimir Chuprov is a campaign director for Greenpeace in Russia.
Very often we heard from Putin that there were statements that climate change is quite good for Russia, then we don't have to buy very expensive fur clothes, so we'll spend less energy for heating system, and agriculture will move to the north. That would be more advantages than disadvantages. And since, I think, 5 years ago, the situation changed.
After years of either ignoring the environment or making jokes about it, Putin signed an executive order to make 2017 the year of the environment.
Perhaps this is the moment when our hero begins to unbutton his shirt and readies to tackle emissions.
Here he is in April this year.
Mr. President, colleagues.
Addressing President Biden's virtual climate summit via an interpreter, stressing Russia's commitment.
Our discussion today demonstrates how deeply we all share the concern with regard to global climate change and how much we're all interested.
Explain to us how it is that Mr. Putin, who, as you say, was joking about how a warmer world will mean that Russians need to spend less money on fur coats, how have we gone from that to what he's saying now? What's happened?
I'm not a psychologist, and I cannot say how this transformation looked like, but the result is good, so his rhetoric is quite progressive.
One thing which could have prompted this change of heart is that Russia is already experiencing the effects of climate change.
I mean, pick an impact of climate change and I can show you on a map where it happens in Russia.
Olga Dobrovidova is another environmental journalist.
When we spoke to her, she was at Moscow's main weather station.
And whenever you hear about a temperature record coming from Moscow, that's recorded here.
Medics report an influx in the number of people suffering from heat and smog-related problems.
The smog has meant we've twice as many people coming here looking for help, both newcomers and...
Back in 2010, when Moscow was shrouded in the smoke from forest fires, it was over 38 degrees centigrade, and that was not comfortable at all.
What did it feel like? What was Moscow like at that time?
It was suffocating, you just had to get away from it. It was impossible to find solace anywhere because the smog from the fires, the smoke was everywhere. It was really hard.
The situation's been made worse by incessant high temperatures that officials say has almost doubled the city's mortality rate.
Smog from the forest fires filled the famous Red Square, but Olga thought to herself,
I was like, what else is new? This is happening every year in Siberia.
Olga should know she's from the middle of the vastness that is Siberia.
Last year, wildfires burned across an area larger than Greece. This year has been even worse, according to Greenpeace, and Olga says there are predictions that climate change could extend the fire season by 45 days.
But Siberia doesn't just face fires. There are also problems with ice. Olga took her microphone home for us, a place called Krasnoyarsk.
Personally, I think it's the best city in Russia, but some people might disagree.
You might be biased.
I might be.
And in Krasnoyarsk, Olga introduced us to someone who's been researching the changing climate at the Russian Academy of Sciences.
My name is Nadezhda Chebekova. Nadezhda means hope in Russian. So I'm a very optimistic person, and I came here to Siberia about 50 years ago. People were very surprised when I left Russia for Siberia. Are you crazy, they say. I said, no, I'm curious.
That was back in 1972.
And when I came, it was so cold. It was minus 52, my first experience in winter. And I didn't realize what was going on.
Nadezh didn't appreciate just how inhospitable the Siberian winter could be.
She tells a story of heading out one day soon after she arrived. She took a bus one way, but when the buses stopped running, she had to walk home.
And she nearly froze to death.
And then in the morning, I learned it was minus 52. Being a climatologist, I had no idea that such temperature may exist. Anyway, 50 years later, I say I don't have a winter coat.
Hey, Neil, Putin was right. Climate change has saved money on winter coats.
The winters are warmer.
About 1.5 degrees warmer. It's quite a number in climatology.
To be clear, this is not good news.
Around 2/3 of Russia is covered by seemingly eternal frozen ground called permafrost, a source of fascination.
When the first settlers went east in Russia, in 17th century, I think this was, and when they reported back to the capital that they had found this weird ground that never thaws, they were not believed. People were like, this is insane, this cannot be.
Olga Dobrovidova describes it as a layer cake of ice and soil packed together.
One thing that's unique, I think, when it comes to Russia is that there's a lot of stuff built on the permafrost. There are entire towns built there. Face a huge risk of being destroyed when permafrost thaws from climate change.
Melting permafrost sounds like a slow-motion disaster, but there are sudden dramatic effects.
One thing that's been happening recently, there are these giant craters opening up in western Siberia.
It's like a twist on the fairy tale of the Three Little Pigs. If you build your house on permafrost and then raise the temperature, that house will probably be blown down more easily.
Vladimir Chuprov of Greenpeace says the wolf's not just coming for people's homes. It's roads, rail lines.
Oil and gas pipelines, 4 nuclear reactors, by the way, hydro dam.
Half of Russian oil and almost all of its gas comes from areas covered in permafrost.
If it melts, trouble.
There's huge risks for the whole Russian economy too, and the Kremlin recognized that. And so there's question mark how much it will be cost to adapt this new global warming and this reality.
What you've described is that the very foundations of Russian economic power are melting.
That's right. That's right. The Russian economical model is melting because of global warming and climate change.
This perhaps explains Vladimir Putin's shifting stance on climate change.
In April, he said climate change is going to be significant for Russia. And if the permafrost melts, quote, we need to know what to do.
Chris Miller from the Foreign Policy Research Institute has been listening to how Putin's language has shifted over time.
I think it is a marker of change in thinking, but I think there is still a pretty substantial gap between the willingness to put clauses in about cooperation on climate change and to actually take tangible steps toward decarbonization.
Let's look at an example of where this gap might be. Take the Paris Agreement, the big international deal to bring down emissions.
Russia's promised to reduce emissions by 30%, a target it's on track to hit. But the key thing, environmental journalist Olga Dobrovidova says, is how Russia is hitting the target. They chose a baseline of 1990.
The only reason Russia is one of the few countries that actually managed to reduce emissions since 1990 was this enormous economic collapse with, I think the emissions went down like 40% at some point, or even further than that. So this is kind of an accounting trick that they use.
The trick is this. Choose a baseline that's followed by a massive downturn where emissions fall not because you're being more efficient, but because the economy is flatlining.
When it gets going again, it gives you room to increase emissions while still hitting your target.
So technically, I think it's achievable even if we do nothing or just coast along, with no specific targeted action on climate change.
Okay, so we're hearing Russian rhetoric on climate is changing, but actions to reduce emissions and therefore reduce the risk of melting permafrost and fires and floods and all the rest of it are not keeping up.
So whose responsibility is that? Remember, earlier, journalist Angelina Davidova said it was hard at times to distinguish who's in charge, government or business. That, she says, has consequences.
On one hand, say from the Russian federal ministries, you very often hear very reasonable and very good ideas about what should be done in the country in terms of introducing a price on carbon, energy efficiency measures, support for renewable energy. But then once they send this legislation draft around, they get very negative reactions from business associations, from other ministries, from other important stakeholders. And a lot of these initiatives, they just been watered down.
Legislation announced in July will require businesses to report their carbon emissions from 2023.
But Angelina says this too has been watered down. It only covers large emitters and voluntary projects to help them reduce their emissions.
Vladimir Chupov from Greenpeace says bureaucrats also slow-walk environmental directives from the Kremlin. Look at the Paris Agreement again. Vladimir Putin committed Russia to it in 2015.
But it took 4 years to get approval. Even then, Putin had to bypass the Duma, the Russian parliament, to make it happen.
If you go with this issue, with Paris Agreement, to parliament, forget it. Because there you have, let's say, parties who are skeptical. United Russia is skeptical.
Which is Mr. Putin's party.
Yes. And again, this is the gap between him and other elites. So he's alone. He is King Lear from Shakespeare. And this is very dramatic.
Okay, we can't let a Shakespeare reference go by.
Never. King Lear, an isolated madman wandering through a storm. It might not be the Putin you see in the calendars, but you can picture him with his shirt off shouting at the weather.
Blow winds and crack your cheeks. Rage! Blow! Here I stand, a poor, infirm, weak and despised old man.
Theatre's loss, our gain. I think what Vladimir from Greenpeace is trying to say with this Shakespearean reference is that if we believe what Putin is saying publicly, he appears to be trying to make some changes. But the machine, the very machine Putin himself created, is stopping him.
I think that's right. We're back to Mr. Putin effectively fighting himself. And sticking with our literary analysis, how does our hero resolve this conflict?
Well, a couple of weeks ago, Russia made an ambitious proposal to cut CO2 emissions by around 80% by 2050 and to reach net zero by 2060.
It's not law yet, so hold the applause, but the timing is important. It's Russia's big statement going into the UN climate talks in November. Chris Miller.
I think only in the past couple of years has the Russian elite realized that whatever they personally think about climate change, the rest of the world is in fact taking it seriously. And so they've got to at least be in tune with the steps being taken elsewhere.
Take the EU, one of Russia's most important customers. The EU wants to reduce emissions much more quickly than Russia does.
But billions have been spent building natural gas pipelines between them. Like it or not, Russia must deal with EU climate ambitions.
In 2020, Brussels announced plans for a possible levy on the carbon emissions of imported products. It sent Russians scrambling to see what that would mean for them.
Ever since then, probably every week, there's now 1 or 2 events about global climate policy, Russian climate policy, because companies are worried. How are they going to live in this new decarbonized world? How can they bring emissions down? Can they buy green certificates? Should they build their own renewable power stations? Can they just plant trees? What can be done?
But there's more at stake than markets here. Russia's relations with the rest of the world have been strained under Vladimir Putin. There are any number of international flashpoints.
There's the annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine.
Support for President Assad in Syria.
Tampering with the US election, according to American intelligence.
Assassinating people on UK soil, according to the British.
The list goes on. Russia is subject to a number of economic sanctions which it would like lifted.
Angelina says if Russia wants to come in from the cold, talking nicely about climate change could open the door.
I feel like Russia is also viewing environmental and climate agenda more and more as the neutral ground to have positive interaction and cooperation with other countries, regardless of other political disputes which might appear.
So it's sort of climate diplomacy?
Right, exactly, yeah.
Our presidents have been clear.
U.S. climate envoy John Kerry speaking to the Russian foreign minister.
That the key is to be able to deal with the climate issue separately. That it's too important, it's too significant.
Russians remain sceptical. Its most recent national security document, which says climate change is a risk, also says climate change is being used by foreigners to restrict, restrain, and impede Russian interests.
The diplomacy here is delicate. Russians aren't the only ones worried what a Russia without oil might look like.
If you were to imagine a scenario where Russia's oil and gas revenues disappeared tomorrow and weren't coming back, I think it's difficult to imagine that a political crisis wouldn't follow. A destabilized Russia might not be any more friendly to the West, but could be substantially more dangerous.
You know, having an unstable nuclear power is frankly scarier than even 3 degrees of warming.
You know, those are two things I wouldn't want to have to deal with.
Well, that's the job of creative diplomats, hopefully.
Indeed.
How optimistic are you about the future? Are you in a place where you now think things are going to change, policies are going to be made? Or do you still see things being watered down and you think, well, for all the pledges, it's a lot of talk and no action?
Well, I would say, I think at this very point in life, I feel more realistic rather than optimistic or pessimistic. So I have a feeling Russia will be moving in this direction, maybe slower than we all want, but it will be moving.
Well, that's a relief then. There's more on the table than World War III and a collapse of the natural order.
Yeah, Neil, cheer up. And before Russia upends its entire political economy, there's lots of easy ways it can bring down its emissions, starting perhaps with thermostats. Did you know lots of buildings in Russia are centrally heated, so people have no control over how hot their apartments get? They regulate the temperature by just opening the windows.
Maybe that's why Putin so often goes without a shirt.
You've solved it.
Enough with the calendar jokes. What's caught your eye in climate news this week, Kate?
OK, so when we cover the climate, one thing comes up quite a lot. It's what's known as a positive feedback loop. And that's where something happens. So let's say I feel sad that after the pandemic, I really cannot fit into my favourite jeans anymore. And the consequence of that, which is me eating a bucket full of ice cream to make myself feel better, instead of that fixing the original issue, it actually exacerbates it and makes it worse. So I'm even less likely to fit into my jeans than ever. But now, scientists in Finland have discovered an unusual example of the opposite, what's known as a negative feedback loop. So, plants in Finnish forests produce organic compounds which go on to become aerosols in the atmosphere, which actually make the clouds more reflective. So they send the sun's energy away from the Earth back into space. And scientists monitored this over the summer for 7 years, and they found that as the temperature increased, plants released more compounds, which made the clouds even more reflective, and that has the potential to stop the planet warming as much as it might have done otherwise.
Okay, so we need to be planting these Finnish plants all over the place to make shinier clouds.
Well, in the grand scheme of things, the impact of all this is likely tiny, but it does show that in their own very small way, plants might be fighting back against climate change.
I love that story. Thank you.
Neil, what have you been seeing in the news then?
Well, get your hanky ready for this one. We've got some background as to why Turkey has finally joined the Paris Agreement.
Okay.
It had been the only G20 nation not to sign up to it. Now it's in.
Exciting. What's changed?
Well, why do I need a hanky, you might ask? Well, According to Turkey's lead climate envoy, part of the answer is sea snot.
Sea snot?
Yeah, he's talking about this thick layer of what looks like mucus, which formed over large parts of the Turkish coast earlier this year, including in the giant city of Istanbul. And there was no avoiding this stuff. It was this disgusting slime which gathered in beaches and ports in prodigious volumes. Turkey's president vowed to rid the waters of what he called the mucilage calamity, and part of that campaign was to sign up to the Paris deal.
Ah, exciting. I enjoy the phrase mucilage calamity. I'll be throwing it into all my conversations this week. How big a deal is this then, Turkey signing up?
Well, I think it's a kind of shot in the arm for the climate talks, which are just about to open in Glasgow, having another country join the big international framework to bring down emissions. Turkey's emissions historically are not that high, but as a growing developing country, they are set to grow. So any efforts to limit those are to be welcomed, I'm sure.
Good news. It is, however, all we have time for. Remember, if you have a climate question, email us at theclimatequestion@bbc.com.
Thanks to our researcher, Soda Ali, producer Jordan Dunbar, series producer Roz Jones, and our editor, Emma Rippon. And the man who makes the mix, Tom Brignall.
Hi, I'm Kim Chakaneta, and I present a BBC Africa podcast called The Comb. The Comb, like its name, is all about combing through the continent for stories that matter, stories about the way we live and the moment that we're living in. Our most recent episode is driven by a central question, which is what's driving hippos to attack and kill fishermen on Lake Naivasha? Now, Lake Naivasha is an expansive freshwater lake in Kenya. And for many years, fishermen and animals have coexisted mostly peacefully. But floods and the economic fallout from COVID-19 have started to pit these hungry fishermen against hungry hippos, sometimes with deadly results. And we're looking at how this speaks to a wider issue as natural habitats shrink and human populations continue to expand. You can listen to that episode by searching for The Comb on podcast apps and audio streaming platforms. That's The Comb, C-O-M-B.